Whenever you perform an ETL process, you need to connect to your source data and your destination data. Let's take a look at how you can create connections in SSIS. Data connections are managed, oddly enough, in the little section down here called Connection Managers. I can expand it by dragging it a little higher here. If I just gotta get my mouse just right, you can see the bar just disappears. Okay, there we go. And the instructions are pretty clear. Right-click here to add a new connection manager to the SSIS package. So I would do so. Now, there's some standard choices that you use on a regular basis. OLEDB, a flat file, ADO.NET, analysis server, and a flat file connection. Excuse me, a new file connection, not a flat file connection, and then a new connection. And choosing new connection gives you a lot of choices. So those ones are obviously just the more common ones that people might use. But you can see from this list that there's a huge amount of options. In fact, you can add more. For the most part, you will indeed use these common ones. The OLEDB, the flat file, and ADO.NET are probably the three most common choices. So you can choose between OLEDB and ADO.NET. The difference between the two is one's much more specific, has a higher level of performance. The other one's much more forgiving with a slightly lower level of performance. In general, I recommend you use the slightly lower one, performance one, that's more forgiving. More forgiving will show up in certain things like types of errors that you normally get with SSIS when you forget to do a data conversion. Or you didn't forget to do it, you just didn't feel the need to do it because you knew that it would work the way it was set up. OLEDB will be more forgiving about those errors. ADO.NET will stop on many of those errors. So just to make your life a little easier, unless you have a reason to use the ADO.NET, I've found that using OLEDB is perfectly fine. And perhaps that's why it's the very first choice on the list. So I can create a new OLEDB connection. When it pops up, you'll see a Connection Manager dialog window. The trick here is to hit the New button and make a connection. This Connection Manager window shows up in a ton of places. Now I just need to go through and put in my server name. If I'm using a named instance, I do that. If I'm using just my default instance, I can use a period. For most people, that will work. You could, of course, use localhost, your computer name, or even the word local in parentheses. All of those choices lead to the same thing. They all just mean come back to your own personal machine. Well, I need to select a database. Let's see, do I have any databases on this server? No, let me switch over to my other one real fast. The other one I've got, this 2014 has, my 2014 installation has a bunch of them. Doesn't really matter. How about Northwind? Okay, I can test the connection if I wish, but if you've got that drop-down box down here working, it's probably just fine. A word of caution, if you use the drop-down box up here, a lot of times it'll take a while for it to complete its search of the network trying to find SQL servers that it could list in the drop-down box. That is perfectly normal, although somewhat irritating. It takes a while for it to time out. I recommend you actually type in this box up here, this drop-down box, but always use the listing drop-down box here just so that you know that the connection is good. That's my recommendation. Okay, so now let's say OK, and we'll say OK again. It will give it a name. Whether you like that particular name or not, that's up to you. I might just actually want to change it. I'll rename it and just tell it that it's Northwind. The reason why I say that is When I move this package to a different machine, let's say I take this package and I send it out to a different machine, the fact that the server name's in there is immaterial because they will probably go through and change it. I go to the property sheet, and change the connection. By clicking on the connection string here, a little ellipse button shows up automatically. You can click on that and get back to the same dialog window. Here I could change the server to a different server if I knew that that different server on my machine would work. Oops, it doesn't work here because, well, I don't have Northwind on this server. You can also double click on the connection. Doing so brings up the same dialog window. It's just the default behavior. That's because they know that when you move packages from one machine to the other, you're probably going to need to change the connection. Now, having a connection is great, but having two connections is more common because you're typically moving data from one to the other. That other one could be a variety of things. But again, most of the time it's going to be one of these top three. Let's choose the second one. There's another very common one. This is a flat file connection. As its name implies, this is where you would take and put the data into a text file of some type. Now, text files come in a variety of flavors. Sometimes they have a TXT at the end. Sometimes they have a CSV at the end. Sometimes they have a TBL at the end. It could be all kinds of things. You could actually just make them up. I would browse to a flat file. Just make up a name. You can see that TXT is a common one, but the other common one is a CSV file. In fact, that's the one I use most often. It is being flagged as being delimited. The text qualifier would mean, do you have quotes around strings of text? The header row delimiter just indicates that the header row, and usually this actually would be the first row in your text file, should have a carriage return after it, a carriage return and line feed. Header row is to skip, and I'm not going to skip any rows. Over here on columns, this is the columns page, they call these pages. You can see that each row of data is going to have a carriage return at the end, and each column in that row is going to have commas in between. That's the way it's set up. That's pretty much the ones that you choose. At this point, there's nothing here to indicate which columns I'm going to work with, but once I have it connected up to a source using a data flow or some other tool, I will then be able to go ahead and do some additional configuration. Quite often, what you do is you wait to actually create a flat file connection until you start setting up your data flow and need it. You can see down here that it says no columns are defined. Well, that's true. That's because I haven't defined what columns I need. It is true I could go through and try to add a new column. And now I'd be able to say, okay, so you could theoretically go through and define what that column is going to look like ahead of time. Output column width, and let's say 50 characters. Then, when you try to match the data up between the source and the flat file destination, you'd have to make sure that the columns lined up correctly with the right data type and the right size. Again, typically what you do is you go through and make something like a data flow. Oops, let me put a data flow on the screen. Oops, that's the wrong toolbox. Let me get, thank you. Let me get the SSIS toolbox. Data flow. I'll go into the data flow and SSIS toolbox. I'll grab a source assistant. And you can see that it shows SQL Server, and it shows that I have a source already. If I were to go over here and use the toolbox again and grab an OLEDB source and drag it on the screen, it would have, if I double click on it, it would allow me to go ahead and choose the Northwind connection. However, if I go to the toolbox and I drag in an ADO.NET source, I double click on it to get the same dialog window, you see that nothing's in here. The reason for that is the OLEDB source, data source and the ADO.NET data source are not exactly compatible. This is an OLEDB data source. And so I must connect, I said data source, excuse me, connection. So I must use a OLEDB source along with an OLEDB connection. This ADO.NET one's not going to work. If I use Microsoft's little source assistant, it just helps me with this process. I still need to go through and define something. I'll go ahead and choose, I think I'll choose the products table. I want to choose only certain columns. I'll uncheck that top box and then just check the product name and how about the price, unit price. Notice the red dot's gone away, and that's because it's configured now to use my source. Now, to show you how to connect up a destination, I'll go over here and add from the toolbox a destination assistant. You can see that there's nothing here for the nothing here for my flat file. It's just kind of the way it's set up. You can also click on this box, but there's really nothing there for that. That's all right. It's still over here as a flat file source. This is important. Before I actually make this work, I need to connect the line, the blue line, from here to here. The reason for that is the blue line, drag and drop, flat file source. Oops, I'm so sorry guys. I chose a source. Let me delete that. Toolbox, not sources, destinations. Did I grab the other one, wrong one when I did this? I didn't think I did, but nope. Okay, that looks right. Much better. So now I can click on the blue line, drag it over. This time I don't get an error message. And as I said, that blue line represents metadata defining things like what data type it is and how many characters length. Now when I go and double click on the flat file, you'll see an option for me to create a new flat file connection manager. Hitting the new button brings up this screen, in which case I can choose my different options. So I'll choose to limit it. And now you'll see that the screen is it's the same screen, not very similar, it's the same screen. In which case I can go and browse to that same location I was looking at before. Say open. Tell it that the column names are in the first data row. And when I come over here to columns this time, you can see it picked up my columns. When I go to advanced, this time you can see that my configuration has been picked up. Whereas before I would have had to do that ahead of time. Preview doesn't really help me much because there's no data to come through. But you are able to see that the header name is at the top. If I go back here and I uncheck that box, come back to a preview, you'll see that it says column 0 and column 1. Whereas if I have that checkbox on, I can see that. Hey, get back there. And you know what? I may have to say OK and come back in then. Update. There we go. You always want to click on the mappings just to make sure that they got the mappings right. Also, as I'll mention later on, this if without doing that, sometimes it'll not correctly write the XML code that's actually behind the scenes. Clicking on the package and choosing View Code shows me that there's a whole bunch of XML code in here being written. Every time you click on something and make a choice, it writes that code. I have learned that when you set up your source and destination, always click on columns to get that XML code to set, and always click on mappings to get that XML code to set. It was only in the earlier versions that seemed to be buggy about this, but I've learned my lesson to not just assume that they've got everything fixed 100% when it only takes half a second to click on those. Okay, so now I could go through and execute this data flow task, and it would transfer data from my source to the destination. I'll click on this link to stop. And now if I were to go to the folder, let's see here. I'll see my flat file. With its data. Okay, very long video. Sorry about the length of it, but it's an important topic, and hopefully this all makes sense. So we've seen how you can create a source and destination in a data flow. We've seen how you can use connections for that source and destination. Next thing we're going to look at is an execute SQL task, and we'll see how we can use those same connections for that option. See you there.